Welcome to Revenge Threads. Today's story? I silently ruined my ex's life and made sure it stayed ruined. Before we start, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? We met the way people love to romanticize in movies. I was 21, fresh into my third year of college in the late 90s when I met Jake. He was 23, recently graduated, brilliant, and already planning his next chapter. A PhD in animal sciences on the opposite coast. I had similar plans. I was moving with friends just an hour and a half away from where Jake would be living. It felt serendipitous. Out of thousands of places in the country, we were both heading to the same corner of it. Not quite together, but close enough. Just a 90-minute drive. He was charming, brilliant, hilarious. He had 2 sisters and a younger brother, all of whom welcomed me like I was already part of the family. I became instant friends with them, and I cherished that more than I realized at the time. Back then, I thought this was it. The real thing. The meant-to-be kind of love. Because Jake was in school and I was working full-time, I usually drove to see him on weekends. He shared a rental house with 2 other grad students, both nice guys. We didn't have money for fancy restaurants or gifts, but we had fun in our own ways. Late-night tacos, cheap wine, movie nights on a lumpy couch, and lots of time spent at his place. Jake bred and sold small animals as part of his PhD work. Rodents, reptiles, and more. He had an entire setup in the house. It was unconventional, sure, but fascinating. I didn't mind the animals. I was just happy to be included. Through Jake, I met his advisor's wife, Mary. She worked in university admin and was kind, grounded, and warm in that way only women in their 50s can be. She and I would get lunch together when I visited. Sometimes it felt like I was closer to his academic circle than he was. Maybe that should have been a red flag. But I was in love and blind and 21. Things started unraveling slowly. Subtly. 2 years into the relationship, we were lying in bed. A familiar space, comfortable, vulnerable, when Jake looked at me and said, "You've gained weight. It's making it harder for me to be attracted to you." Just like that. No warning. No pretense of concern for my health. No softness in his voice. Just inconvenience. I remember sitting up, blinking in disbelief. I wasn't a size 0, no. But I was maybe a size 6 or 8 and had been since the day we met. I'd gained what? Maybe 10 pounds? Nothing dramatic. And even if I had, who the hell was he to talk? But I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just said, well, maybe if you offered me more than crackers and string cheese on weekends, I wouldn't be so starved when I got home. I wasn't joking. I'd been living on cheap snacks whenever I visited while Jake couldn't afford to go out. That was fine, until now when he used it as ammo against me. I looked him in the eye and asked, "So what's your solution?" He blinked, stammered, "Well, I guess you should try to lose weight." I didn't laugh. I didn't rage. I just said, "No, I'm not doing that." "So what are you going to do?" He had no answer. So I pulled on my clothes, went to bed in the guest room, and drove home the next morning like nothing happened. But something had shifted. And I think he knew it. 3 months later, he called me. No emotion in his voice. No hesitation. "I want to break up," he said. My heart stopped, but I held steady. "Why?" I asked. He hesitated. Then, "You don't know enough about science." That was his reason. I worked in communications, not research. I had always asked questions, tried to understand his field, even met half his department. But apparently not knowing every Latin name for a lab rat was grounds for dismissal. I didn't buy it. I pushed back, demanded the real answer. He held the lie as long as he could, but I kept pressing. And finally it cracked. He admitted he'd been seeing someone else. A 19-year-old undergrad. One of his students. Her name was Meg. I screamed at him to get the hell out of my life. My roommate threatened to throw him off our second-floor balcony if he didn't leave immediately. He left. And then something strange happened. I started laughing. Because all at once it clicked. The weight comment. The way he pulled away. The awkward barbecue where Meg had spilled soda on her pants, and Jake had offered my sweats. which of course didn't fit her because she was several sizes larger. He'd been trying to get me to break up with him, because he was too cowardly to admit he was already cheating, and too stupid to realize that I wasn't the kind of woman who ran away when someone pushed her. He wanted out. He had it. But he didn't realize that by burning the bridge, he was setting his own life on fire. He just didn't know it yet. A few days after the breakup, I sent a polite email to Jake's roommates. Not out of kindness. Out of strategy. I thanked them for always being welcoming, for being decent to me over the years, and let them know, without drama, that Jake and I had ended things. I expected nothing in return. Closure maybe. Just acknowledgement. But the replies I got? They cracked the door open. And behind it was a very ugly truth. George was the first to write back. He had always been the nice one, warm, funny, the kind of guy who never quite fit into Jake's cold little world. His message was short but genuine. I'm really sorry, you didn't deserve that. For what it's worth, I think he was scared to tell you because he knew Meg wasn't even close to being your equal. It made me laugh. Not because of the insult, but because of the truth. Jake didn't cheat with someone better. He downgraded in every way just to feel powerful again. The second roommate messaged me too. And that's when the full truth came out. They had known. They had known for weeks. And they had told Jake that if he didn't tell me about the affair, they would. That's why he broke up with me so suddenly. Not because of weight. Not because of science. Because the clock had run out. Then George said something else. He asked if I wanted help collecting the rest of my things. Said Jake was gone that weekend and I could swing by safely. Or, he added, we could grab drinks after. Blow off steam. I smiled at the screen. Because that's when it clicked. This wasn't a post-breakup pickup line. This was an invitation. Not just to get my stuff, but to do something far more satisfying. To take a step towards something Jake never expected. Revenge. I drove up on Friday night. The house looked the same. But I didn't. I wasn't the girl coming to see her boyfriend. I was a woman who'd been lied to, discarded, and quietly underestimated. And that made me more dangerous than Jake ever realized. George let me in with a grin. Still want those drinks later? He asked. I nodded. Let me get a few things first. But I wasn't there for sweaters or books. I was there to observe. Jake had always been sloppy, especially with his animal projects. His breeding operation took up half the house, spilling into common areas. Tanks and cages and shelves of equipment. The works. I knew what was legal. I knew what wasn't. And I knew one thing Jake had been hiding. An endangered species. He wasn't breeding it. It was a permanent rescue, unreleasable. But he hadn't registered it. He refused to file the proper paperwork, pay the fee, or notify the state wildlife office. Why? Because he didn't want the government in his business. Typical Jake. And there it was, right in the tank by the back window. I pulled out my camera and took photos. Time-stamped. I photographed his entire setup. The overcrowded cages, the exotic species not allowed in the state, the poor conditions of some of the animals, and one tank that, by law, had to be reported. I wasn't just grabbing evidence. I was building a case. Then we went out. George took me to the kind of bar Jake hated. Loud, chaotic, filled with people who didn't care about scientific names or dissertation drafts. We danced. We drank. We laughed until our ribs hurt. And when we came home, we made a scene. He carried me into the house, both of us tipsy, both of us loud. Jake and Meg were there, watching TV like a Hallmark couple. Until I stumbled in wearing a short dress and George paraded by in nothing but his boxers. We weren't sleeping together. But Jake didn't know that. Meg definitely didn't. We made noise. We made sure they heard. I chewed a donut slowly at the kitchen table the next morning, hair a mess, dress wrinkled, not an ounce of shame in my body. Jake finally snapped. You didn't have to act like a whore in front of me. I smiled sweetly. Well, you didn't have to screw a teenager behind my back, but here we are. George leaned in and kissed my head. Meg looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. I stood up, grabbed my bag and said one final thing before I walked out. Have fun with my leftovers. But the noise, the flirting, the donut? That wasn't the revenge. That was just the trailer. The real story. It was already printed, labeled, and ready for mailing. To the State Department of Fish and Wildlife. Because Jake wasn't just a bad boyfriend. He was a careless, arrogant, and illegal animal handler. And I was going to make sure someone noticed. The morning after I walked out of Jake's house, messy hair, lipstick smudged, and full of quiet satisfaction, I drove straight home, slid into my pajamas, and laid the photos out on my bed. I didn't need to look at them twice. I knew exactly what I had. An unregistered endangered species. Overcrowded breeding environments. At least 2 animals not permitted in the state. Improper conditions for handling wildlife under a student research license. In other words, a whole pile of regulatory violations tied to one name, Jake's. I poured myself coffee and picked up the phone. The woman who answered at the State Office of Fish and Wildlife had a surprisingly calm voice for someone whose job probably involved a lot of angry hunters and frightened campers. Hi, I'd like to report possible illegal animal keeping and endangerment, I said. She didn't ask how I knew what I knew. Just asked me to describe what I'd seen. I gave her the address. The species. The conditions. When she asked for photographic evidence, I smiled. Already printed and ready. She gave me the name of the regional field officer. Said he'd probably want to follow up in person. I asked, "Can I stay anonymous?" "Absolutely," she replied. Then she asked one more question. "Are you sure this isn't a personal dispute?" I almost laughed. "No. This is a professional concern. I happen to know the owner is applying for federal research grants and may not be operating within the law." There was a pause. Then she said, "Understood." And just like that, the fuse was lit. A few days later, George called me. He was giddy. "Guess who showed up today?" he asked. I didn't have to. The state had arrived. 2 agents. Plain clothes, badges, clipboards. They knocked politely, explained they'd received an anonymous tip, and asked to speak with the property's tenants. Since George was on the lease and Jake wasn't even home, he had every right to let them in. He offered them coffee. Meg hovered awkwardly nearby, unsure of what to do. Jake had never taught her what to say when state wildlife officials came knocking. They walked through the living room, examined the tanks, asked questions. They took notes. Asked if any of the animals belonged to George or the other roommate. They said no. Everything belonged to Jake. The agents didn't touch anything that day. They didn't need to. They saw enough through the window to apply for a warrant. And once they got it, they came back. George called me the day it happened. "They're taking everything," he said, practically vibrating through the phone. "They brought a truck. Actual wildlife handlers. It's like a crime show." He was breathless in awe. "They've got paperwork, boxes, animal crates, the works." They asked me to confirm what was Jake's. Meg tried to say the animals were hers, but they didn't buy it. She didn't even know what half of them were called. Jake wasn't home at the time. Apparently, Meg tried to call him. He didn't answer. She panicked, then drove to campus to find him. And by the time Jake returned, his world had already cracked open. They confiscated every animal except a tank of guppies. Even the illegal one in the back room. Even the endangered rescue he'd refused to register. Even the setup that cost him thousands to maintain. Gone. All of it. But it wasn't just the animals. Jake's entire academic path depended on federal research funding. And he had just received a prestigious EPA grant. One of the big ones, the kind that opens doors and locks in postdoctoral positions. So, naturally, I made another call. To the EPA. I asked, as calmly as possible, how does one report misuse of funds or regulatory violations tied to an active research grant recipient? They connected me to someone in compliance. I told them everything. Not anonymously this time. I wanted this part to stick. I explained the violations, the ongoing investigation by state officials, and the legal concerns surrounding his breeding practices. I gave them the case number. I offered to submit documentation and photos. And then I said, this grant was awarded to a student who is already under investigation by a government agency. Shouldn't that trigger a pause or review? The man paused. And then he said the words I wanted. Yes. Please send everything you have. Jake didn't go to jail. He didn't have to. Because what he lost was worse. The animals, gone. The funding, revoked. The scholarship, pulled. His teaching position, terminated. He wasn't expelled, not officially, but the university offered him a quiet deal. Downgrade to a master's, walk away without a fuss. And he took it. He couldn't afford to stay. Not without the grant. Not after the fines. A few weeks later, Mary, his advisor's wife and my old friend, called me. She'd heard what happened. She wasn't surprised. I told her everything. The affair. The student. The emails Jake had sent after the breakup. The screenshots I'd saved. She was quiet at first. Then she said, he always thought he was the smartest person in the room. I'm glad someone reminded him otherwise. She passed the information to her husband. Official complaints were filed. Jake never stood a chance. And the best part? He never knew I was behind any of it. He thought he broke up with me on his terms. But the truth? He just gave me space to build the case that ended his future. And I wasn't done yet. Not even close. You know what people like Jake fear more than law enforcement? Whispers. Rumors. Knowing glances. Because once the institutions start asking questions, there's still a chance to deny, to minimize, to spin the story in your favor. But once the people start talking, you're done. And that was my next move. The night George and I went out, the night I staged the world's most strategic walk of shame, we didn't just drink and laugh and strut past Jake and Meg like it was a reality show. We also told a story. Loudly. To the right ears. Bars near a university are filled with students and staff. Many from Jake's department. Some from the very classes he was a TA in. So when George leaned in at the bar and said, "Did you hear Jake sleeping with one of his students?" we weren't exactly keeping it subtle. He said it once. Then again. Then someone else repeated it. I didn't even have to push. It spread like spilled beer on a bar floor. In a small academic department, gossip is faster than email. Within days, the story was everywhere. Some people rolled their eyes. Others were outraged. A few students, especially the women, were furious. Because Meg wasn't just any girl. She was 19. A freshman. And Jake had been her TA. That alone was enough to spark whispers. But when word got out that he was flaunting the relationship during the semester, everything changed. What he had done wasn't just unethical. It was stupid. And it was about to cost him a lot more than his scholarship. George and the other roommate, bless them, didn't stay quiet either. They filed formal complaints with the department. Reported the relationship. Reported how Jake had lied about it. Reported how it affected his grading and classroom behavior. They didn't even need to prove favoritism. The fact that he was in a position of power while dating a student was enough. And since he wasn't exactly subtle about it, taking Meg to class parties, having her over during study sessions, making out in the house with the door open, it wasn't hard to verify. By the time the academic board started asking questions, the damage was done. The department was embarrassed. And embarrassed departments? They act fast. They didn't expel him. No, that would have required a formal hearing, and they didn't want the scandal. So they pulled a classic move. Finish your current work, downgrade to a master's, and walk away. No ceremony. No dissertation. No title. Just a quiet exit. With nothing but a dented resume and the kind of whispers that follow you for decades. Meanwhile, I called Mary. Told her everything. The affair, the complaints, the EPA grant, the illegal animals. And Mary? She was livid. He'd liked Jake. She'd vouched for him. Now she realized what he'd done. To me. To Meg. To their institution. "I'll talk to my husband," she said, "and I'll make sure this never gets buried." I sent her the email Jake had written me, the one where he admitted everything. She didn't even ask twice. She just said, "Got it." At this point, it wasn't just a personal revenge story. It was a campaign. Jake had weaponized his intelligence, his status, his charm. And I was dismantling all of it. Bit by bit. Quietly, legally, strategically. And now the people around him were doing the rest. By the time Meg realized what was happening, it was too late. Students avoided her. Professors whispered behind closed doors. One of her lab partners asked her flat out, "So, was the A in that class before or after you started dating your TA?" She cried in the hallway. And Jake? He stormed out of a faculty meeting when they asked him, not kindly, if his personal conduct was becoming a liability to the university. It was everything he feared. Not lawsuits. Not arrests. Humiliation. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to expose him publicly. I just made sure the right people saw what he really was. And then I watched them do the rest. Because revenge doesn't always come with fire. Sometimes it spreads like smoke. And by the time they notice, it's already in the walls. By now, Jake had lost almost everything that gave him power. His scholarship? Gone. His teaching position? Terminated. His reputation? In tatters. But there was still one piece left on the board. The EPA grant. And that one, I saved for dessert. A few weeks before he dumped me, Jake had bragged about the grant. It was a big deal. Federal money for research in animal science, tied to his graduate work and future postdoc aspirations. He acted like it was a golden ticket, the kind of thing that could secure his entire career. And he had it, until I picked up the phone. I didn't call the general hotline. I knew better. I researched the department that issued the grant, found the compliance office, got the name of the grant officer assigned to Jake's cohort. Then I drafted the email. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't dramatic. It was structured, formal, and backed by documents. Subject: Grant recipient under investigation, urgent disclosure. Hello. I'm contacting you regarding a current recipient of an EPA-funded academic grant. Full name, affiliated with, university name. I believe it's important to inform your office that this individual is currently under investigation by state fish and wildlife authorities for multiple violations, including housing endangered species without proper documentation, illegal possession of restricted animals, and improper care conditions. I have attached photographic evidence, timeline records, and contact details for the state officials involved. Additionally, name was recently terminated from his position as a teaching assistant for misconduct related to an inappropriate relationship with an undergraduate student during the semester. These events may constitute violations of grant eligibility terms under your ethical conduct policy. Please confirm receipt. My name. I received a reply 2 business days later. It was short. Thank you for this information. We will begin an internal review immediately. If needed, we may follow up for further details. They didn't need to follow up. The evidence I'd sent was airtight. Photos, emails, reports. And the kicker? His arrest record. Jake had managed to avoid jail time thanks to his dad's lawyer, but he had been charged. And that charge, while reduced, was still on record, just buried deep enough that a university background check didn't flag it. But federal funding? They dig deeper. And I made damn sure they found it. It took less than a month. Jake's grant was revoked. He was ordered to return funds already used. Nearly $30,000. Money he had already spent. He couldn't pay it back. Not without loans. Not without crawling to his father again. And even if he did, the damage was done. Once you lose a federal research grant due to misconduct, you're blacklisted. No agency will touch you again. Not the EPA. Not the NIH. Not the NSF. His academic career, the one he'd been building for nearly a decade, was dead. Not on paper. Not with handcuffs. But with a stamp in a file that says, "Do not fund prior ethical violations." And the most beautiful part? Jake had no idea I was behind any of it. He thought the investigation came from a nosy neighbor. He thought the university complaints were from George and the other roommate. He thought the EPA just randomly decided to audit his file. He never once looked in my direction. Because he still believed I had just walked away. Quiet, heartbroken, passive. He underestimated me. He always had. Sometimes revenge isn't about rage. It's about structure. Knowing what to say, who to say it to, when to wait, when to strike. No. He was out of academia, out of funding, out of options. And I hadn't even raised my voice. Time passed. The academic bomb had gone off. Jake's future was toast. He scraped together what was left of his pride and finished out a downgraded master's program. Then he disappeared from my life. At least for a while. I moved on too, slowly but intentionally. Got my own master's. Found work I loved. Even fell in love again with someone kinder, smarter, less performative. But one thread from the past still tugged at me. His family. His sisters had always been kind to me. His younger brother too. During those years we dated, they welcomed me in like I belonged there. Holidays, family gatherings, late night calls when Jake was too busy or too cold. I loved them. And I missed them. But after the breakup, I hadn't reached out. Why would I? Jake had cheated, lied, manipulated, and I'd walked away from everything that came with him, including the people who hadn't done anything wrong. Until one afternoon about 6 months later, I got a message. From one of his sisters. Just a simple line. "I miss you. I hope you're okay." I stared at the screen. Tears welled up unexpectedly. Because I wasn't sure if I had the right to miss them too. But I did. So I wrote back. I told them the truth. I explained, carefully, calmly, that Jake hadn't broken up with me because of distance, as he told them. He cheated. With a student. After trying to get me to break up with him first by calling me fat and pretending it was my problem. I told them about the comments. The lies. The barbecue with Meg. The real reason I left. And then, just to be clear, I forwarded them Jake's own emails. The ones where he admitted to falling for Meg. Where he insulted me, my education, my intellect. I didn't editorialize. I just showed them. And waited. The responses came in fast. From both sisters and his brother. "He told us you left because you couldn't handle the long distance. He said it was mutual. I can't believe he actually said those things about your body. You didn't deserve any of that. And finally, we're still your friends. We always were." It broke something open in me. Not grief. Not rage. But relief. They told me how awkward it had been, Meg trying to fit into family events, pretending to be cool with everyone. But she was tense, quiet, never made eye contact with the sisters. Apparently, at one point she tried to bring up how she and Jake met, and one of the sisters changed the subject so fast it was like a whip crack in the air. I laughed when they told me. Because even without knowing the whole truth, they knew. And they didn't like her. Not because she was Meg. But because she wasn't me. Time passed. I reconnected with the siblings now and then. A lunch here, a birthday text there. They had their own lives. So did I. But I never told them about the state wildlife report. Or the university complaints. Or the EPA fallout. I didn't need to. My work was done. Or so I thought. 10 years later, yes 10, I sent a wedding gift to one of the sisters. Something small, thoughtful. She was surprised, touched, and apparently mentioned it at her co-ed bridal shower. Jake was there. And he lost it. He started ranting out loud in front of guests about how his siblings were still friends with me but never truly accepted Meg even after all these years. It was awkward, loud, embarrassing. And that's when his sister, the bride, laughed and said, "I don't make it a habit to be friends with homewreckers." The room went silent. Because suddenly everyone understood. Including Jake's parents. They'd never known the full story. They thought I left. That Jake had moved on. That the two of us just didn't work out. But now they knew. And Jake? He had to sit there surrounded by family and realize that he didn't just lose me. He lost their respect. He never found out I was behind the formal complaints. Or the grant revocation. Or the raid by the wildlife officers. But in that moment it didn't matter. Because the people who once looked at him with pride now looked at him with something else. Me. I wasn't even in the room. But I still won. 2 decades. That's how long it had been. 20 years since I left Jake's life in flames. 20 years since I built a career I was proud of. 20 years since I saw his face. I had become a specialist in scientific communication. The girl he once said didn't know enough about science now worked with PhDs, biotech firms, even government agencies. I translated complex medical and environmental data into language the public could understand. Ironic? Yes. Poetic? Definitely. That week I was lecturing at a university. One of the bigger ones. Room packed with undergrads, grad students, professors. I spoke about ethics in research communication, how storytelling shapes public understanding of science. It was one of those electric moments where I felt everything I'd worked for, every scar, every step, had led me here. After the talk there was mingling. Handshakes. Compliments. And then, "Hey OP, long time no see." The voice came from behind me. I froze for half a second. Then turned. It was Jake. He looked smaller. Not physically, though age had softened him, but something in his posture, in the way he said my name, like he didn't quite believe I'd turned around. I didn't flinch. Didn't gasp. Didn't even raise a brow. I smiled politely. "I'm sorry," I said. "Do we know each other?" He blinked. "It's me, Jake." I tilted my head. "Jake?" He laughed awkwardly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We dated. College. Come on." I widened my eyes slightly, just a flicker of feigned recognition. "Oh, right. Well, that was ages ago." Still calm. Still smiling. Like I was reading off a weather report. He looked uncomfortable. Like he didn't know whether to laugh or be offended. I didn't care. He reached out to hug me and I stepped back. Just slightly. Enough for him to notice. "Well," I said brightly. "Lovely to see you. Enjoy the rest of your evening." And I walked away. That was it. No drama. No closure. No apology. He got to see me on stage, respected, composed, accomplished. And I got to see the look in his eyes when he realized the girl he once dismissed didn't even have space in her memory for him anymore. But the universe wasn't done. At dinner that night, a few faculty members took me out. As we chatted over wine and grilled fish, one of them asked, "So, you know Jake?" I looked up. "Met him ages ago," I said lightly. She leaned in. "He's been here this week, interviewing for a teaching position." I nearly choked on my drink. "He's what?" "Yeah, quiet guy. Said he used to teach. We were actually thinking of hiring him." I couldn't help it, I scoffed. They all looked at me. I composed myself. "I'm sorry," I said, still smiling. "Just surprised he's still teaching after what happened at University X." Pause. "What happened?" "He was sleeping with one of his students while he was her got fired. Lost his grant. Left the program with a downgraded degree." The looks on their faces told me everything. They didn't know. Now they did. A few days later I got a call. Mary. She was retired now but still connected. Someone called the old department to ask about Jake, she said. And they pulled his file. Fired as a T. Grant terminated. State complaint. Even the old arrest record from the wildlife investigation was still in the archive. You think he'll get the job? She laughed. Not a chance. So there was. Full circle. Jake, the man who once told me I wasn't smart enough, sat in the audience while I lectured a hall full of scientists. He came hoping for a job. He left with a memory of a woman who smiled like he was no one. Because after everything, that's all he ever was. No rage. No name calling. Just irrelevant. I used to think revenge was the end of the story. The finish line. The grand finale where the villain falls, the curtain closes, and I walk away stronger, shinier, better. I was wrong. Revenge was never the end. It was the middle. The clearing. And everything that came after, that was the real story. After Jake was gone, truly gone, my life didn't suddenly sparkle with joy and victory. There wasn't some movie moment with triumphant music playing behind me as I held my diploma and flipped my hair in the wind. No. There was grief. Not for him, but for the girl I had been. The one who wanted so badly to be enough. The one who smiled through manipulation. Who explained away red flags. Who thought being cool meant not reacting when he insulted her body. She didn't die when I left Jake. She evolved. Because of what I did next. I went back to school. Not just to get a degree, to prove something to myself. Jake once told me I didn't know enough about science. So I built a career out of translating science. I learned how to take the most complicated concepts in medicine, biology, pharmacology, ecology, and communicate them clearly, beautifully, powerfully. To patients. To students. To journalists. To the world. I started working with universities, hospitals, public health departments, national parks, museums, and production companies. I wasn't just speaking science. I was shaping how the public understood it. And every time someone said, "Wow, you explained that so well," I heard it as a victory. Not over Jake, but for her. The girl who once thought not knowing the Latin name for a tree frog made her unworthy of love. My work took me around the world. Not always glamorous. Sometimes dusty fieldwork, sometimes fluorescent-lit hospitals, sometimes Zoom calls in hotel lobbies, but it was mine. And with every mile, every flight, every page of notes, Jake got smaller. Not because I forgot, but because he didn't matter anymore. Still, sometimes I'd think about that timeline. If he had broken up with me honestly. If he had said, "I've met someone else. I've fallen for her." Would I have left quietly? Would I have walked away with dignity? Would I have ever known the things he was hiding? Maybe not. And maybe that's why I'm grateful for the insult. The cowardice. The why. Because without it, I wouldn't have looked closer. Wouldn't have found the illegal animals. Wouldn't have made the call. Wouldn't have discovered what I was capable of when I stopped trying to be agreeable. And here's the thing no one tells you about revenge. It doesn't always feel good. Sometimes it feels empty. Sometimes it feels sad. Because when the dust settles, you still have to live with yourself. So I made sure I liked who I became. Not a woman defined by retaliation. A woman defined by resilience. A woman who defends herself without apology. A woman who uses her voice like a scalpel. Precise, effective, never wasted. I don't stalk Jake online. I don't wonder what Meg's life looks like. I don't replay the old fights or relive the betrayal. Because that chapter's over. Taught me everything I needed. No. I teach others. I mentor younger women in my field. I remind them that being underestimated is not a flaw, it's a weapon. That silence is not grace if it's suffocating you. That boundaries aren't rude, they're sacred. And that revenge? It isn't always about breaking someone down. Sometimes it's about building yourself up so high, they can't even reach your name in the wind. Dear me, you don't know it yet, But tonight, lying in that bed, half-dressed, heart thudding, face flushed from his words, will be a turning point. You'll think it's just another fight. You'll try to laugh it off. You'll even ask him coolly what his solution is, because even at 23, you already knew how to put up a front. But I know how hard it hits. I know how you'll cry on the drive home the next morning, hands tight on the wheel, trying to convince yourself you imagined the whole thing. That you're overreacting. That maybe you have gained weight. That maybe if you just exercised more, ate better, fixed yourself, he'd love you the way he did before. Sweetheart, listen to me. You were never the problem. He said he couldn't be attracted to you anymore. But what he meant was, I'm cheating and I'm too much of a coward to say it. He said he needed someone who understood science. But what he meant was, I feel threatened by how much people like you without you trying. He said he wanted to be honest. But what he meant was, I'm too weak to take responsibility for the wreck I created. None of it was about you. None of it. I want to tell you something you won't believe right now. One day, not too far from where you are, you will become the kind of woman who terrifies men like him. Not because you're cruel. Not because you're vengeful. But because you're free. Because you'll walk into rooms where everyone waits to hear your voice. Because your work will be sought out by people he used to worship. Because the body he tried to shame, it will carry you through every win, every stage, every applause. And you won't shrink for anyone. Especially not him. There will be days you'll still hear his voice in your head. Speaking. Mocking. Dismissing. You'll hear him when you hesitate before wearing a certain dress, or when you look in the mirror and see curves he once weaponized. But over time, that voice will fade. And your own voice, soft at first, then louder, will say, he lied. He lied to protect his ego. And to punish you for no longer making him feel superior. You'll outgrow him. Outlearn him. Outlive every limitation he tried to place on you. And years from now, decades even, you'll stand in front of a room full of students, professors, professionals. And he'll be sitting in the back row, just a face in the crowd, and you won't even feel anything. Because he'll be no one to you. Just a name you once knew. Just a boy who lost his future the moment he tried to shrink yours. So hold your head up. Cry if you need to. But don't carry his words with you forever. They're not bricks. They're ashes. Let the wind have them. And walk forward. He has no idea who you'll become. But I do. And I promise you, he's extraordinary. Who love, no, free. The truth is there was no final blow. No dramatic confrontation. No teary apology. No public takedown. Jake faded the way all cowards do. Quietly. Like smoke curling under a door until it disappears. I didn't chase him. Didn't wonder what could have been. Because there was nothing left to salvage. I still think about him sometimes. Not in longing. Not even in anger. But in amusement. The way you might remember an ex who claimed you'd never make it, right before you started a six-figure career. The kind of man who mispronounced your name during the breakup conversation. Who told you that your body was the problem, while hiding an illegal animal in his bedroom. The kind of man who could name every Latin species of lizard, but couldn't spell accountability if you spotted him every vowel. He doesn't know where I live. Doesn't know what I've built. He probably still tells people the breakup was mutual. That we grew apart. That I just wasn't as academic. Let him. Let him sit in rooms full of men who nod politely. Let him Google my name and see me on panels he wasn't invited to. Let him hear my voice on documentaries explaining science to the masses, and realize the woman he said couldn't keep up now leads the conversation. Because here's what I learned. Revenge isn't fire. It's not a headline. Not a courtroom. Not a mic drop. It's peace. The kind that lives in your chest like a quiet, permanent freedom. It's walking through your own life and never having to flinch when someone says his name. It's eating what you want, wearing what you want, laughing as loudly as you want, Because you no longer carry someone else's shame in your skin. He lost a degree, a grant, a job, a future. But I gained something better. I gained clarity. And a life that doesn't include him in the credits. Every once in a while someone asks me, if you could go back, would you do anything differently? And I smile. Because sure, I could say I'd walk away sooner. Ignore the insults. See through the lies. But then again, I wouldn't be me. The woman who stood up, picked up every piece and built something indestructible out of the rubble. The woman who walked out of his life without looking back. And never stopped walking forward.